All right. So one last thing about polar molecules. So water was an example of a polar molecule. We saw that there was a net dipole pointing towards the oxygen because oxygen is more electronegative than um, hydrogen, right? And so what are some ramifications of polar molecules? One, in terms of physical properties. One is that they'll actually respond to an electric field because they're charged, okay? Because they have minus and positive charges. And so if you put water in an electric field, it will actually orient itself towards that electric field. So think about, like, pretend these are little positive and minus charges, and you apply voltage across these plates, right? You'll have the atom that's positively charged be oriented towards the negative plate, and you'll have the atom that's negatively charged, or atoms in the case of water for positive charged, right? The negatively charged ones will be towards the positive plate. And so I was going to do in class a demo where basically you have a stream of water, like from your sink. You can actually try this at home. And if you get a certain type of plastic, it doesn't work great with like polyethylene water bottles, but polypropylene is good. It's a certain type. It's usually a little bit of a harder plastic if you have a piece of that lying around. And what you can do is you can take a paper towel and rub the paper towel really fast against the piece of plastic, the piece of polypropylene, and that will cause it to become charged, right? Static electricity. And then get a thin stream of water, like from your sink, if you get it really thin. And if you put that water bottle or that piece of plastic close to it, but don't touch it, you'll see it's pretty cool. The water stream will actually bend towards the piece of plastic. It's attracted to it because it's charged too. So water is charged, and you charged up the piece of plastic through static electricity. So anyway, that's like one physical ramification of molecules being polar. The other thing is polarity. Molecular polarity really dictates solubility. Okay, and so ionic compounds are very polar, and they tend to be, except for some exceptions, which we learned in chapter 4 with our solubility chart that we have, right? They tend to be very soluble. Ionic compounds do. And the reason is because they have very polar bonds, right? They have a positive and negative charge. Well, even if you don't have an ionic compound, but you have a polar molecule, like sugar, for example, that's a polar molecule that's not ionic. It will be soluble in water because it's polar. And so the idea is that water is polar and sugar is polar, and so they're soluble in one another. And so we say like dissolves like. The charges like to interact. The converse is also true. Non-polar things like to dissolve non-polar things. This is why soap is, so like oil, okay, non-polar, that'd be like oil and gasoline or something like that, okay? They're both mostly carbon-hydrogen bonds in there. Those are very non-polar bonds. Delta electronegativity we calculated in the previous video is 0.4, right? That's a non-polar bond, so it's a non-polar molecule overall. So oil and gasoline would mix and be soluble. Soap is so good at being soap because it has polar and non-polar parts to the molecule. So you can see this head right here, what's called the head, hydrophilic head, it's actually ionic. So there's an ionic part that's very ionic and then very polar. And then there's a non-polar part, which is carbon-hydrogen bonds, all non-polar bonds. That's very non-polar. And so the non-polar part can dissolve grease, right? Grease is an example of non-polar things. And the polar stuff can dissolve like salt, okay, or sugar. And so it's really good for washing your hands, really good for cleaning dishes, because it can dissolve both of these things. And so it's kind of this idea of like dissolves like dictates a whole bunch of things. Really important. You can think about like chlorophyll and how different molecules in biology and in plants, in this case, have polar, and this would be a polar head right here. Non-polar heads gives it different functions. Okay, this non-polar part allows it to be inside of a cell wall and kind of stay there. The inside of a cell is non-polar. You can think about an oil spill. How's the best way to clean up oil spill? Well, you're going to have to use something non-polar to get rid of that oil, to dissolve it, or capsaicin. You know, if you get something in your eye, um, some spicy pepper oil in your eye, how are you going to get rid of that? It turns out, you know, no matter how much water you put in your eye, um, it's not going to help because it's not going to dissolve it. It's a pretty non-polar molecule, and that means your eye is going to be burning for a while because you don't really want to put oil or anything else in your eye. Okay. Um, and it dictates like things like protein folding, which, you know, are really important for how our bodies work and all biology works. A lot of diseases are caused by protein misfolding. And so this is how proteins fold and start from amino acids and form these really complicated tertiary and quaternary structures. That's all, well, a large part it's due to like dissolving like. The non-polar amino acids like to be next to the non-polar amino acids. So those parts of the protein will be fold so that they can get as close to one another as possible. And the polar parts like to be near other polar parts. They're kind of dissolving each other. All right.